History books paint Richard the Lionheart as a heroic king. But why do so many key parts of his life vanish from the official record? Today, we're uncovering the missing pieces, the politics, and the erasure that turned a real king into a manipulated myth, and finally reveal who Richard the Lionheart actually was. For centuries, Richard the Lionheart has been remembered as the fearless king who led the Crusades, fought with unmatched courage, and became a symbol of medieval chivalry. But what if the real Richard was far more complex and far more dangerous than the stories told about him? And what if later rulers had powerful reasons to hide his actions, alter his deeds, and even delete parts of his legacy entirely? This is the untold story, the one they tried to erase. The story of Richard the Lionheart is often told as if it were perfectly preserved, a clean legend passed from one generation to the next. But the deeper you go into the records of the 12th century, the more you realize something unsettling. Far too many pieces of Richard's life simply aren't there. Whole episodes are reduced to vague summaries. Major decisions vanish from royal documents. Key relationships are mentioned once then never again. And the people responsible for recording history at the time appear to have chosen their ink carefully, because the man we call Richard the Lionheart may not be the same man those lost chapters once described. The first clue that something was wrong lies in the transition between Richard's reign and the reign of his brother King John. Chroniclers who once wrote about Richard with admiration suddenly shift their tone. Early manuscripts praise him as the model of knightly virtue, the ideal Christian warrior, a king who carried the cross with unwavering conviction. But in later revised copies of those same works, the tone changes. The admiration is softened. The victories become smaller, the flaws become larger. It feels less like history and more like someone quietly editing a legend to make it less threatening to the new power on the throne. But the missing chapters go deeper than scribal bias. Richard's early life is one of the most mysterious periods of any English king. We know he was born in Oxford, we know he grew up in Aquitaine, but we know almost nothing about the shaping of his mind. His tutors, his closest childhood companions, the early battles that honed his ruthlessness, nearly all of it is absent or blurred. Medieval chronicles often love to exaggerate childhood events, yet in Richard's case, silence dominates. It's as if the people recording his rise didn't want the world to know what made him the warrior he became. When Richard left for the Third Crusade, more unusual gaps appear. The Crusade was documented heavily by both Christian and Muslim writers, and yet Richard's arrival in the Holy Land is strangely inconsistent across these sources. Some describe him storming onto the scene like an unstoppable force. Others barely mention his movements until major battles begin. There are days, even weeks, where Richard's actions are unclear. Historians have proposed countless theories from secret negotiations to unrecorded skirmishes, but without the missing documents, these theories are shadows cast on a blank wall. Then there are the letters royal correspondence. That should exist, but doesn't. Kings in the medieval era wrote constantly, to allies, to enemies, to their own courts. Richard especially was a diplomat as much as a warrior, yet the surviving letters attributed to him are shockingly few. Some scholars believe they were destroyed intentionally after his death. Others think they were intercepted or suppressed during his long captivity. But the absence of these letters means that entire political maneuvers, personal intentions, and strategic decisions have been wiped from the timeline. We see the outcomes, but the motives behind them remain invisible. The greatest gap of all appears near the end of Richard's life. In the months leading to his fatal injury at Chalice, Richard's movements become strangely undocumented. We know he was campaigning in France. We know tensions with rebellious vassals were reaching a breaking point. But the chroniclers are vague about the causes, the conflicts, and the stakes. One source claims Richard was negotiating a rebellion. Another claims he was suppressing one. A third insists he was after hidden treasure. With so many contradictions and so few reliable details, it's impossible to reconstruct what Richard was truly fighting for in those final days. When Richard was struck by the crossbow bolt that would kill him, the record becomes almost theatrical, filled with stories that sound more poetic than factual. A dying king forgiving the man who shot him, a dramatic final confession, a peaceful passing surrounded by loyal knights. But these scenes appear only in later chronicles. None of the earliest sources describe such a romantic ending, which means these final moments too were rewritten, enhanced, or possibly entirely fabricated. So much of Richard's life is viewed through what remains, but what remains is only a fraction of what once existed. And those missing pieces were not lost by accident. They were shaped, trimmed, rewritten, or removed by people who lived after Richard, people who had reasons to reshape the memory of a king, whose legend threatened to overshadow their own authority. When Richard the Lionheart died, the crown did not simply pass to his brother John. It passed into the hands of a man who carried a deep resentment, a fear, and an insecurity that shaped the way history remembered Richard. But to understand the political agenda behind erasing him, you have to imagine a kingdom mourning the loss of a warrior king while simultaneously being forced to accept a ruler who lacked his charisma, his military brilliance, and most importantly, the loyalty he inspired. John knew from the moment he wore the crown that he would forever be compared to Richard, and comparison was the one thing he couldn't afford. Because in the harsh reality of medieval politics, a king's power existed only as long as his reputation did. Richard had a legend. John had a throne he could barely hold. And that imbalance set the stage for one of the most subtle and effective character rewritings in British history. The first wave of political control came quietly. Chronicles, those long parchment histories written by monks and scholars, were revised under John's rule. Some were softened, others completely restructured. Chroniclers were not independent journalists. They relied on royal favor, royal protection, and royal funding. A king didn't need to tell a scribe exactly what to write. He only needed to make it clear what version of history would be rewarded. And under John, the version that thrived was the one that shrank Richard's legacy, emphasized his flaws, and portrayed his reign as reckless and burdensome. This wasn't just political strategy, it was survival. John needed to shift public memory, and the easiest place to begin was with the pen. But the agenda extended beyond the chronicles. Diplomatic documents, letters, decrees, and even property grants made during Richard's reign began disappearing or being replaced by newer versions that cast his decisions in a negative light. When modern historians examine these records, they find gaps, contradictions, and oddly convenient losses of material. Land disputes that Richard had settled were reopened under John, but the official justification often relied on missing legal documents that could no longer be located. These weren't coincidences, they were tools. Tools used to undo Richard's political legacy, challenge his alliances, and weaken the loyalty of nobles who had supported him. And loyalty was the real battlefield. Richard had something John desperately wanted: a network of barons, knights, and foreign allies who respected him because of his military genius. John lacked that. The barons saw him as unreliable, indecisive, and in some cases outright cowardly. So, John's government worked to reframe Richard not as a fearless warrior, but as a king whose campaigns drained the treasury, whose ambitions endangered the kingdom, and whose absence weakened England. If Richard could be portrayed as irresponsible, then John's failures might appear less damning by comparison. It was not enough to elevate John. Richard had to be minimized. This agenda even influenced England's relationship with the Church. Richard's time on the Third Crusade had forged powerful ties with religious leaders across Europe. John, however, clashed with the Church repeatedly. To maintain control, he encouraged clerics to emphasize Richard's sins and mistakes, his heavy taxation, his brutal sieges, and his relentless pursuit of warfare. Stories that once glorified Richard's courage became cautionary tales about pride. Sermons began portraying him as a king whose strengths were overshadowed by his recklessness. This was not spontaneous moral reflection. It was political redirection shaped by a king who needed the Church to justify his weakening grip on power. Outside England, John's agenda reached even further. Diplomatic relations with France transformed during his reign, and French chroniclers took note. Richard had challenged French authority, defeated French armies, and humiliated French kings. Writing positively about him was dangerous, especially when John was bending to French demands and losing territories Richard had once secured. So the French narrative shifted too. Richard's victories were downplayed, his strategies simplified, and his leadership reframed as reckless aggression. In some French chronicles, he is almost unrecognizable, a caricature created to suit political needs. What makes this agenda especially powerful is that it worked. For generations, Richard was remembered as a king who abandoned England, taxed his people, and cared only for war. And while some of those criticisms contain fragments of truth, they became exaggerated because they served the political ambitions of the rulers who came after him. The more successful Richard appeared in memory, the more incompetent his successors looked. The more revered his legacy remained, the more fragile their own reputations became. So instead of preserving the full story of a complex, formidable king, history was sculpted by those who feared standing in his shadow. When people hear the name Richard the Lionheart, most imagine a flawless hero, a fearless warrior leading armies into battle, a devout Christian on a noble quest, a king whose courage inspired generations. But the truth about Richard was far more complex. The man behind the legend was not born from myth. He was forged in a world of politics, violence, and relentless pressure, a world where every decision carried life or death consequences. Understanding who Richard really was requires stepping past the heroic facade and looking at the contradictions, the choices, and the motivations that shaped him into the king history both admired and feared. Richard's personality was a tangle of extremes. On one hand, he was remarkably intelligent and strategic, able to read a battlefield, anticipate enemy movements, and inspire loyalty in his troops. Contemporary accounts describe him analyzing every detail, thinking in terms of both immediate action and long-term consequences. He could be charming, persuasive, and capable of negotiating peace when it served his goals. He was also deeply committed to the ideals of knighthood and Christian warfare, carrying himself with a sense of honor that earned him the admiration of friend and foe alike. But beneath that exterior lay impatience, a volatile temper, and a merciless streak that could terrify even his closest allies. Those who failed him, or even appeared to fail him, faced harsh retribution, sometimes disproportionate to the offense. This duality made him unpredictable, a king whose greatness could inspire awe but whose wrath could devastate entire regions. His personal relationships also reveal layers of complexity that are often erased from popular narratives. Richard maintained deep bonds with certain nobles, knights, and allies, yet he could be ruthless toward family members or political rivals who threatened his objectives. His relationship with his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was both a source of strength and tension. Eleanor was a formidable figure in her own right, and her influence over Richard's upbringing and decisions was enormous. Their interactions reveal a dynamic where loyalty, love, and ambition were constantly intertwined, showing a king who was shaped as much by family politics as by the battlefield. Even with allies, Richard was calculating, weighing the benefits of loyalty against the risks of defiance, a balancing act few rulers could manage successfully. Richard's approach to warfare also reflects his complexity. He was not just a brute force, swinging swords and charging knights into battle. He understood psychology, logistics, and strategy. Siege warfare, troop morale, supply lines, and diplomatic maneuvering were all part of his arsenal. Yet he could also be impulsive, taking bold risks that frightened both his allies and enemies. In some campaigns, his actions seem reckless. In others, they are masterstrokes of military genius. This blend of audacity and intelligence made him both brilliant and dangerous, a king who thrived on high-stakes challenges and who understood that history often remembered the results more than the costs. Religion was another dimension that added depth to Richard's character. He was outwardly a devout Christian, participating in the Crusades and portraying himself as a defender of the faith. But his faith was not simply pious devotion. It was entwined with politics, honor, and personal ambition. The banner of religion could justify decisions that were practical, strategic, or self-serving. Richard wielded faith as skillfully as he wielded a sword, shaping his actions to align with both divine authority and earthly power. The tension between spiritual duty and political necessity was constant, and navigating that tension required a mind capable of both conviction and compromise, traits rarely recognized in simplified accounts of his life. Even Richard's reputation as a heroic figure was carefully managed, both by himself and by those around him. He understood the power of perception and the importance of symbolism. His armor, his presence on the battlefield, his participation in tournaments and public ceremonies, all were part of a calculated image that reinforced his authority. Yet behind that image, the real Richard was human, capable of fear, doubt, and personal grief. He endured the pain of betrayal, the loss of comrades, and the constant threat of assassination. His strength was as much about surviving these pressures as it was about conquering foreign armies, revealing a king whose legend often overshadowed the very human struggles that made him extraordinary. To truly know Richard the Lionheart, we must peel back the layers of myth, propaganda, and selective memory. We must see a man who combined intellect with instinct, courage with cruelty, and loyalty with pragmatism, a king whose life was lived in extremes and whose legacy was contested long before it became legendary. One of the most overlooked aspects of Richard the Lionheart's life is the network of secret alliances and carefully chosen enemies that defined his reign and shaped his legacy. While history often simplifies his story into a binary of hero versus villain, the reality was far more intricate. Richard was a master of subtle diplomacy, creating covert partnerships and navigating hidden rivalries that many chroniclers of his time either ignored or deliberately erased. Understanding these relationships reveals a side of the king that goes beyond the battlefield, a king whose power depended as much on alliances forged in shadows as on victories won in the open. Richard's alliances often began in unexpected places. During the Third Crusade, his most famous campaign, Richard did not act alone. He engaged in secret negotiations with Muslim leaders, including Saladin, and even cultivated connections with lesser-known local rulers who controlled key territories. Some of these alliances were tactical, allowing Richard to secure supply routes, gather intelligence, or avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Others were more subtle, forming bonds of mutual respect and trust that transcended religious and cultural divisions. These relationships were often kept out of official accounts because they did not fit the heroic narrative of a purely Christian warrior fighting an entirely Muslim enemy. By maintaining these hidden alliances, Richard demonstrated a pragmatic side of leadership that emphasized survival and strategy over ideology. At the same time, Richard had enemies whose opposition was not always straightforward. Some were obvious: rival monarchs, rebellious barons, or foreign powers who sought to weaken his influence, but many were hidden within his own network. Ambitious nobles, jealous of his authority or frustrated by his absence from England, acted as covert adversaries. These internal enemies created constant challenges for Richard, forcing him to balance trust and suspicion in every political move. He had to be vigilant, discerning who could be counted on in times of war and who might betray him for personal gain. The skill with which he navigated these hidden threats speaks to a level of political sophistication rarely acknowledged in popular retellings of his life. Richard's alliances also extended to unconventional partners. Some of the most surprising relationships involved mercenaries, foreign knights, and even local tribes along the coasts and trade routes of the Mediterranean. These groups were not always loyal out of admiration for the king, but because of carefully negotiated incentives, payment, protection, or political recognition. Richard understood that power in the medieval world was not absolute. It had to be negotiated and reinforced continuously. He used these alliances to supplement his own forces, compensate for logistical challenges, and create a network that extended far beyond the borders of his kingdom. In many ways, these secret arrangements allowed him to act with autonomy in the Holy Land while England faced internal turmoil back home. On the flip side, Richard's enemies were often forced into the open by his decisive actions. When diplomacy failed, when covert alliances could no longer maintain order, he confronted opposition head-on, whether through sieges, punitive expeditions, or strategic intimidation. Yet, even in warfare, Richard was calculating. He often preferred to neutralize threats through negotiation or manipulation rather than brute force alone, demonstrating that his mastery over enemies relied as much on cunning as on courage. By understanding the motives, loyalties, and ambitions of those around him, Richard was able to turn potential adversaries into temporary allies or At the very least, neutralize their impact on his campaigns. What makes Richard this network of alliances and enemies especially fascinating is how little of it survived in the historical record. Many of these relationships were deliberately downplayed or omitted by chroniclers who wrote after his death. Political rivals, including his own brother John, sought to minimize Richard's achievements and obscure the complexity of his strategies. Documents that revealed covert agreements were lost, destroyed, or rewritten. As a result, much of Richard's genius in political maneuvering went unrecognized for centuries, leaving a simplified version of a man who was in reality a master strategist, a king who could build bridges even while engaging in war. Examining these secret alliances and hidden enemies gives a clearer picture of Richard, not just as a warrior, but as a leader navigating a dangerous and multifaceted world. It shows a king who understood that power was never purely in the sword, that diplomacy and deception were as vital as courage and strength, and that survival depended on anticipating both the seen and the unseen threats surrounding him. It was in this delicate balance between allies and adversaries that Richard's true brilliance as a monarch emerges, and it is here, in the shadows and the whispered agreements, that much of his untold story lies. When most people think of Richard the Lionheart, they picture him charging across the deserts of the Holy Land, sword in hand, leading his Crusaders against the armies of Saladin. The image is so iconic that it has been repeated in countless history books, films, and illustrations, yet this heroic narrative is only a fraction of the story. The Crusades were not simply a series of glorious battles or noble acts of piety. They were tangled with politics, strategy, and choices that historians often downplay or leave out entirely. The narrative most widely taught paints Richard as a flawless warrior on a righteous quest, but the truth reveals a far more complex, and sometimes morally ambiguous, king navigating a world filled with uncertainty, compromise, and human cost. One of the most striking omissions from the usual story is how strategic Richard truly was in the Holy Land. The Crusade was not just a religious endeavor, it was a highly calculated military campaign in which Richard constantly balanced limited resources, hostile terrain, and shifting alliances. He was not a reckless warrior charging blindly into battle. He was a general who carefully considered every move. Supply lines had to be maintained, reinforcements coordinated, and local intelligence gathered. Richard negotiated with local leaders, sometimes forming temporary alliances with factions who were not Christian, all to secure safe passage, provisions, or tactical advantage. These alliances, often omitted from traditional narratives, show a king who understood that military success depended on strategy as much as valor. Richard's interactions with Saladin, often romanticized in legend, also tell a different story when examined closely. While stories portray the two as noble opponents engaged in a dramatic battle of honor, the real relationship was more nuanced and pragmatic. Richard recognized Saladin's skill and authority, and he respected the need for compromise when necessary. There were moments when the two leaders engaged in direct communication, negotiated truces, and even exchanged gifts to secure political goals. These were not acts of chivalry alone, they were calculated moves to protect Richard's forces, conserve resources, and maintain the fragile balance of power in the region. The sanitized versions of the Crusade gloss over these political subtleties, making it seem as though Richard's heroism was divorced from the strategic decisions that kept him alive and successful. Another aspect often ignored is the human cost of the Crusade. Richard's campaigns involved sieges, massacres, and punitive actions against both combatants and civilians. Chroniclers sympathetic to Richard either omitted or downplayed these actions, portraying them as unavoidable consequences of war rather than deliberate choices. In reality, Richard's campaigns could be brutal, and his decisions often reflected calculated calculations about morality, diplomacy, and intimidation. The version of the Crusade presented in textbooks tends to emphasize heroism and righteousness while muting the ethical complexity, the collateral damage, and the sheer weight of responsibility that Richard carried as both commander and king. Moreover, Richard's absence from England during this time adds another layer to the narrative that is rarely discussed. He spent the majority of his reign abroad, which left the kingdom vulnerable to internal unrest and political maneuvering by his enemies. His focus on the Crusade was not only a demonstration of personal ambition, but also a political gamble that risked everything at home. Chroniclers often frame this absence as noble dedication, but in truth, it left England exposed to rebellion and financial strain, and the consequences of this absence were downplayed or shifted onto his brother John in later accounts. Finally, the Crusade narratives they don't teach obscure the meticulous diplomacy Richard employed even amidst warfare. Every negotiation, every temporary truce, and every strategic compromise was designed to advance his long-term goals. He was not a figure driven solely by faith or glory. He was a ruler balancing military necessity, political reality, and personal ambition. This side of Richard's character is rarely presented in the grand heroic image of the Lionheart. Yet, it is crucial to understanding why he was so successful and why his contemporaries feared and respected him. By examining the untold aspects of Richard's crusade, a richer, more complex portrait emerges: a king who was as much a strategist and diplomat as he was a warrior, a man whose actions were guided by calculation, risk, and the ever-present weight of consequence, a king navigating a labyrinth of moral and political challenges that history has too often simplified. Richard the Lionheart's story did not remain buried forever. After centuries of selective memory, misrepresentation, and deliberate erasure, his legacy began to resurface in ways that even the chroniclers who sought to diminish him could not have predicted. The process was gradual, subtle, and deeply intertwined with shifts in political priorities, cultural interests, and historical scholarship. To understand why Richard's legacy suddenly reappeared, we must look beyond popular imagination and into the forces that allowed a forgotten or maligned king to reclaim his place in history, slowly revealing the man whose life had been carefully manipulated for centuries. One major factor in the revival of Richard's legacy was the changing perception of kingship itself. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, European societies began to romanticize historical figures in new ways. The qualities that had made Richard threatening to his successors, courage, military prowess, and an unwavering personal presence, were suddenly celebrated rather than feared. Scholars and storytellers began to revisit his campaigns, his leadership, and his personal charisma, portraying him as the quintessential warrior king. This shift in cultural values made it possible to examine Richard not as a threat to contemporary power, but as a subject worthy of admiration and study. In essence, the same qualities that had been suppressed to protect political agendas were now recast as virtues to be celebrated in literature, chronicles, and public memory. Archaeological discoveries and the preservation of previously overlooked documents played an equally vital role. For centuries, key letters, treaties, and military records from Richard's reign were hidden in monastic archives, private collections, or foreign repositories. Modern historians, driven by curiosity and advances in archival research, began unearthing these materials, and each discovery offered a new window into Richard's complex life. Documents detailing his strategic brilliance, his political foresight, and even his negotiations with Saladin challenged the long-standing narrative of a king whose reign was reckless or purely symbolic. As these records came to light, scholars could reconstruct events with far greater accuracy, revealing a Richard whose actions were deliberate, calculated, and often misunderstood. The development of historical methodology itself was a turning point. Earlier chroniclers wrote for patrons and rulers, blending narrative with moral lessons, propaganda, and personal bias. Modern historians, however, adopted a more analytical approach, cross-referencing multiple sources, evaluating the credibility of accounts, and reconstructing events from fragments that had previously been dismissed. This scientific approach to history allowed Richard's story to emerge in its complexity, showing him as both a human being and a strategic genius. Suddenly, the king who had been erased was appearing on the pages of scholarly works, textbooks, and biographies, providing a new lens through which the world could view him. Another factor was literature and popular culture, which played a surprising role in reviving Richard's image. Plays, poems, and later novels took inspiration from the fragments of his story that survived, embellishing them while preserving the essence of his courage and ambition. Even when historical accuracy was secondary, these works kept Richard in public consciousness, slowly building a collective image that demanded reconciliation with the sparse historical records. As a result, by the time rigorous academic research caught up, the public was already primed to accept Richard as a heroic and influential figure, ready to embrace the restoration of his legacy. Political shifts in England also contributed to this resurgence. As later monarchs sought legitimacy through association with legendary predecessors, Richard's image became a useful symbol. Kings, governments, and even nationalist movements highlighted his victories, his courage, and his symbolic role in the Crusades to inspire loyalty and pride. The same narrative that had once been dangerous because it overshadowed John or other successors now became a tool to strengthen contemporary authority. By repurposing Richard's legacy for new political purposes, historians and storytellers ensured that he would no longer be a forgotten king but a figure celebrated for both his military and symbolic significance. Finally, international interest rekindled the focus on Richard's life. Scholars in France, the Holy Land, and across Europe revisited his campaigns, alliances, and diplomatic negotiations, bringing new perspectives that challenged previous Anglo-centric or politically biased accounts. Richard's interactions with Muslim leaders, his diplomatic acumen, and his strategic brilliance were all reassessed in light of these broader, more nuanced studies. This global perspective highlighted the true impact of his reign, not only on England but on the broader political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe and the Crusader states. By combining these factors, changing cultural values, archaeological discoveries, advanced historical methods, literature, political agendas, and international scholarship, Richard the Lionheart's legacy emerged from obscurity. It was no longer confined to the selective, diminished portrayals created by those who feared his memory, but restored as a vivid portrait of a king whose life, decisions, and influence continue to captivate historians and the public alike. Richard the Lionheart was far more than the simplified hero or reckless warrior portrayed in history books. He was a king of contradictions, brilliant yet volatile, ruthless yet strategic, feared yet respected. His life was shaped not only by battles and crusades but by politics, alliances, and the deliberate manipulation of his story by those who followed him. For centuries, key chapters of his reign were erased, his victories minimized, and his complexity obscured. Yet, despite the attempts to diminish him, Richard's true legacy could not be buried forever. Today, thanks to modern scholarship, archaeology, and a re-examination of medieval chronicles, we can see the man behind the legend, a king who navigated perilous alliances, calculated risks with precision, and commanded respect across the battlefields of Europe and the Holy Land. We now understand that his story is not just about heroism, but about survival, strategy, and the relentless shaping of memory. Richard the Lionheart was a figure so extraordinary that even history itself struggled to contain him. A king whose shadow stretches across centuries, reminding us that the past is never as simple as it seems. In uncovering the erased chapters, the hidden alliances, the unrecorded negotiations, and the true complexity of his character, we are finally able to meet Richard as he truly was, a warrior, a strategist, and a king who, despite attempts to fade him from memory, continues to inspire awe and curiosity even today.